When I was 8 years old, my grandmother gave me a doll. It wasn't the kind of doll you might imagine a boy would want. Certainly not the kind of gift I'd hoped for. I remember unwrapping the shiny, crinkling paper, expecting a race car or a new set of action figures. The doll was old, very old. Its face was pale and cracked, with paint that had worn away from its cheeks and lips. It wore a tiny suit, complete with a little bow tie, and its head tilted slightly to the left, as if it were perpetually curious. Its glass eyes were deep-set, too large for its face, and seemed almost alive in the way they caught the light. "His name is Mr. Felix," my grandmother said. "He used to belong Uncle." That was a revelation I didn't like. Uncle Robert had disappeared when he was 10 years old, long before I was born. My mom never talked about him much, but every now and then, I'd catch her staring at his picture, her expression heavy with something I couldn't name. I didn't want Mr. Felix, but refusing gifts wasn't an option in my family, so I mumbled a thank you and placed him on the bookshelf in my room. From there, he sat silently, watching over everything with his painted grin. First, I tried to ignore him. The first few nights, I turned him to face the wall, but somehow, in the morning, he was always staring straight ahead again. I convinced myself that I'd just forgotten. Maybe I'd left him that way before falling asleep. But as the days went by, it started to bother me more. There was something wrong about Mr. Felix. It wasn't just his unsettling appearance. It was the way his eyes seemed to follow me around the room, no matter where I stood. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, like someone murmuring just on the edge of hearing. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and scanned the room. Everything was still. Then I noticed Mr. Felix. He wasn't on the bookshelf anymore. He was on my desk. I couldn't explain how he'd moved, but there he was, sitting perfectly upright, his little legs dangling over the edge. His head was tilted slightly forward, as if he were watching me. The room felt heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. His wooden body was cold and strangely heavier than I remembered. I placed him back on the shelf, facing the wall, and crawled back under the covers, willing myself to fall asleep. The next morning, Mr. Felix was gone. I tore my room apart looking for him, but there was no trace of the doll anywhere. Part of me was relieved. Maybe someone had taken him during the night. Maybe my mom had decided he was too creepy and thrown him away. But when I came down for breakfast, there he was, sitting at the head of the table, a piece of toast placed neatly in front of him. I screamed, backing away so quickly that I tripped over the chair behind me. My mom came rushing in, her face a mixture of alarm and annoyance. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, but when I pointed to the doll, she just frowned. That night, I locked Mr. Felix in the closet. I wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure, convinced that whatever was happening would stop if I just kept him contained. But as the hours stretched on, I began to hear the whispering. This time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't just random murmurs, it was a voice. A child's voice, soft and high-pitched, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. The sound was coming from the closet. Then there was a knock, soft, deliberate, 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. I couldn't move. My entire body felt frozen, every muscle locked in place. Then, slowly, the chair I'd wedged under the doorknob began to slide across the floor. The door creaked open just a crack, and there he was, Mr. Felix. His head was tilted further now, as if he were studying me, curious about what I might do. The dim light from the street lamp outside my window caught his glass eyes, making them glint like something alive. I wanted to scream, but the sound lodged in my throat, strangled by the suffocating fear that had gripped me. And then his mouth moved, It wasn't like in the movies, with smooth articulation or a ventriloquist trick. No, it was a jerky, stuttering movement, like a rusted hinge being forced open. The painted line of his smile split slightly, enough for a whisper to slip through. "Come play." The voice wasn't quite right. It was too soft, too distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside him, echoing through hollow wood. His tiny hands, chipped and worn, gripped the edge of the doorframe, and for a moment, I thought he was going to crawl toward me. I couldn't let that happen. I threw the book at him. The doll toppled backward, his head striking the floor with a sharp, unnatural crack. The sound made me wince, but I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I leapt from the bed, my legs shaking so badly I nearly collapsed, and sprinted to the hallway. I spent the rest of the night on the couch in the living room, the lights on and the TV playing softly to keep the silence at bay. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. My mom found me there the next morning, her brow furrowed in confusion. "You look terrible," she said. "Did you sleep at all?" I shook my head, but I didn't tell her why. What could I say? That the doll she'd insisted I keep was moving on its own and whispering to me in the dark? She'd just brush it off like she always did. That night, I resolved to end it. I wasn't going to let Mr. Felix haunt me anymore. I waited until my mom was asleep, then crept back into my room. The closet door was still ajar, but the doll wasn't where. My stomach sank as I scanned the room, half expecting him to leap out from the shadows. Finally, I spotted him. He was sitting on my desk again, just like that first night, his legs dangling over the edge. But this time, his head was turned, facing the window. He wasn't looking at me. It felt deliberate, as if he was giving me the chance to act. I grabbed a pillowcase and, with trembling hands, shoved him inside. I tied the top as tightly as I could, double knotting it for good measure, and stuffed the bundle into my backpack. I was going to get rid of him for good this time, somewhere far away where he couldn't find his way back. The streets were eerily quiet as I rode my bike to the edge of town. The landfill wasn't far, but the journey felt endless, every shadow stretching too long, every sound amplified by the pounding of my heart. When I finally reached the gates, I tossed the bag as hard as I could into the heap of trash and didn't look back. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. For the first time, I felt safe. But the peace didn't last. The next evening, as I was doing my homework at the kitchen table, the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but then the whispering started again. Faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. "Come play." My blood ran cold. I turned toward the sound, my heart sinking as I saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was small, no taller than my knee, and its head was tilted to the side in that same unnatural way. Couldn't be him. I'd gotten rid of him. I'd seen him disappear into the garbage heap. But as the figure stepped closer, the dim light revealed his cracked face, his painted grin wider than ever. Mr. Felix had come back. This time, he didn't wait for me to react. As I stood frozen, he began to move. Not in the stiff, jerky way I would have expected, but fluidly, like a living thing. His little legs carried him across the floor, his tiny hands reaching for the table leg. The whispering grew louder, overlapping with itself until it became a cacophony of voices, all urging the same thing. "Come play, come play." I grabbed a chair and shoved it toward him, but it didn't even slow him down. He climbed over it with an almost unnatural agility, his glass eyes fixed on mine. In desperation, I backed into the corner, my hands searching for anything I could use as a weapon. Then the lights went out. The whispering stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. His presence was palpable, an oppressive weight in the darkness. And then, just inches from my ear, I heard it. "I'm here." The words felt like icy needles piercing my skin. My entire body froze, my breath hitching in my throat as the darkness seemed to thicken around me. I reached blindly for something, anything, that could protect me, my fingers brushing against the edge of the table. Clinging to it for balance, I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stay upright. The silence pressed in, suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of something scuttling across the floor. Not footsteps, no, it was too quick, too light for that. It sounded like nails dragging against the hardwood, darting from one corner of the room to the other. My head whipped around, but the blackness swallowed everything. "Who's there?" The whispering returned, soft and close, as if it were coming from just behind me. "Come play with me." I turned sharply, nearly tripping over myself, but there was nothing there. The scuttling sound moved again, this time closer to the doorway. I bolted for it, my heart hammering in my chest, and stumbled into the hallway. Moonlight streamed through the window at the far end, casting long, pale shadows that seemed to ripple and twist as I passed. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The kitchen loomed ahead, its familiar shapes rendered strange in the dim light. I grabbed a knife from, clutching it so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind raced. Was I losing it? Had the doll really moved? Or was my exhaustion playing tricks on me? Before I could answer, the whispering started again. It was louder now, echoing through the house, coming from every direction at once. "Play with me. Play with me." The sound was maddening, overlapping voices that seemed to burrow into my skull. I covered my ears, the knife shaking in my hand, but it didn't help. The whispering was inside me now, crawling under my skin, twisting my thoughts. The kitchen lights flickered, a dim strobe that revealed flashes of movement, a shadow darting along the far wall, something small and quick slipping beneath the table. I gritted my teeth, my back pressed against the counter as I scanned the room, the knife trembling in my grip. Then I saw him. Mr. Felix was perched on the windowsill, his tiny frame outlined against the pale light. His head tilted slowly, unnaturally far, until it was nearly horizontal. The sight of it made my stomach churn. His grin was wider now, the paint flaking at the edges, and his glass eyes seemed to glisten with something wet, something alive. "You can't leave me," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind even though his mouth didn't move. I snapped. My fear turned to rage, a wild, desperate fury that burned away the paralysis. With a scream, I lunged at him, slashing with the knife. The blade struck wood, and for a brief, heart-pounding moment, I thought I'd won. But then he laughed. It wasn't a child's laugh. It was something deeper, darker. A sound that seemed to shake the walls and reverberate through my chest. The doll slipped from the windowsill, landing on the counter. He was moving again, faster than I could react, his tiny hands scrambling toward me. I slashed again, but he dodged, his movements fluid and unnatural, like a puppet with invisible strings. Before I could strike again, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into total darkness. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. I swung the knife wildly, feeling the air shift around me as if something was circling, taunting me. The whispering had returned, louder than ever, weaving around me in an endless loop. And then I felt it, a hand, small, cold, wooden, gripping my ankle. I screamed, kicking out with all my strength. The grip loosened, and I heard the doll tumble across the floor. But the relief was short-lived. Something heavy hit me from behind, knocking the knife from my hand. I fell forward, my hands slamming against the tile. Mine, the voice hissed, closer now, as if it were inside my head. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving, and made a break for the front door. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, the hallway longer than I remembered, the door receding with every step. I could hear him behind me, the scuttling, the laughter, the whispers. He was everywhere. Finally, I reached the door, fumbling with the lock as panic threatened to overwhelm me. My hands were slick with sweat, slipping against the cold metal, but I managed to twist it open and burst into the night. The air outside was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the house. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the street, collapsing onto the sidewalk. My chest burned, my legs felt like jelly, but I was free, or so I thought. When I looked back at the house, I saw him. Mr. Felix was standing in the window of my bedroom, his head tilted, his grin impossibly wide, and in the pale moonlight, I swore I saw his hand move, lifting in a slow, deliberate wave. The whispering returned, faint but clear, carried on the wind like a promise I couldn't escape. I'll always find you. The doll never truly left me. Even after that night, after I swore I'd never go back to that house, I couldn't escape him. My mom was furious when I refused to return, but I couldn't tell her why. I moved in with my dad, who lived in a cramped apartment across town, hoping distance would be enough to keep Mr. Felix away. For a while, it seemed to work. The whispers stopped. The nightmares faded. I started to believe I'd finally escaped, until the day the package arrived. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. My dad handed it to me casually as I sat at the kitchen table, unaware of the icy dread that began to pool in my stomach the moment I saw it. The paper felt rough against my fingers, the twine binding it too tight, as if whatever was inside had been forcibly contained. "You gonna open it?" my dad asked, noticing the way I hesitated. I shook my head, mumbling something about not knowing who it was from. He shrugged and left me alone with it. I didn't open it for hours. I just stared at it, the knot in my chest tightening with every passing second. Deep down, I knew what was inside. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, I untied the twine and peeled back the paper. And there he was, Mr. Felix. His suit was more tattered now, his paint more worn, but his glass eyes were the same, glinting, alive, watching. A single note was tucked into the box beneath him, written in shaky, uneven letters. "You can't throw me away." I tried to burn him. That was my first thought, fire. If distance couldn't destroy him, then flames would. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid from under the sink, doused him in it, and dragged him to the alley behind my dad's building. The match trembled in my hand as I struck it, the tiny flame flickering in the night air. But as I moved to drop it, the whispering began again. "Don't. Please." I froze, the match burning dangerously close to my fingers. The voice was quieter now, softer, almost pleading. It wasn't coming from the doll's unmoving mouth, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. "Please don't hurt me," the voice said, and for a moment, I faltered. Was he afraid? I shook my head violently, trying to push the thought away. It was a trick. It had to be. But the match burned out before I could act, leaving me standing there in the darkness, paralyzed by doubt. I couldn't bring myself to try again. Instead, I buried him. I found a spot in the woods on the edge of town, deep enough that no one would stumble across it. I dug a hole with my bare hands, the cold earth biting into my skin, and placed Mr. Felix inside. His glass eyes seemed to glint one last time as I covered him with dirt, his painted grin disappearing beneath the soil. When it was done, I stood there, panting, staring at the unmarked grave. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of relief. Maybe this would finally be the end.